Welcome back. This is section 1.1, part 2. We're looking at cells and genetic expression. In our previous class, we introduced the study of biology, what it means to study biology, and how to study biology. Now we're going to take a closer look at the parts of life that we study to really get to the roots of understanding life. And I'm going to argue that to study life is to study the cell, okay, or to understand the cell. So then cellular biology is as close as we can get, we think, to studying life, because the cell, as it currently stands, represents the fundamental unit of life. Okay, so studying life boils down to studying the cell. All right. The cell then is the smallest unit of organization that carries out the processes of life. We should emphasize again and again, the basic unit of life is the cell. So then we need to understand its parts, and as we mentioned before, how they are related and how they interact. Okay. All right. I might emphasize here before we get to the parts of the cell. I might emphasize that when we look at an organism and its actions, we might think of their actions as a reflection of the functions of the cells. Okay. So again, to study life is to understand the cell. Okay. So let's begin by looking at cells. Cells in reality have a whole lot in common. In fact, each cell has a membrane. Let's begin there, because the membrane is what makes it separate or discrete from other cells and other parts of the body. Okay. The membrane is the part that surrounds the cell. It controls what comes in and out of the cell and separates it from everything else. Okay, so we started with the membrane, and we emphasized that this is what makes a cell discrete. Okay, now what types of cells are there? So let's keep it very basic at the beginning. We're just in chapter 1, and let's say that for now, let's say that there are two types of cells: prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Okay, so we might simply just remember for now that when we're talking about plants and animals, we're talking about eukaryotic cells. Okay, plants and animals, eukaryotic cells. So what is a eukaryotic cell then? Well, it's going to have a membrane. Okay, we talked about that before. And it's going to, what's different is this membrane is going to hold all the parts of the cell together. It's going to enclose it and keep all the parts inside. Let's call these parts organelles for now. Okay, the parts of the cell. Organelles. So a prokaryotic cell then is going to lack that membrane that holds it all together. Okay. So that brings us to DNA and genetic expression. So when we're studying life then, we need to understand how life continues, or how life is transferred, how life carries on, or how life results from life itself. Okay. So we just said that cells have membranes, and the eukaryotic cells have the membrane that holds the organelles within the cell itself. So let's look closer at cells, and let's emphasize the chromosomes within cells. Let's call chromosomes for now the parts that hold DNA within. Okay. So then our next question is, within these cells that have chromosomes, and the chromosomes that hold DNA, then what is DNA? Keeping it simple, we might call DNA the information of life. Or more specifically, we might call it the instructions for carrying out life. Okay. Then, let's review. Cells hold chromosomes. The chromosomes hold DNA. DNA is the instructions for carrying out life. So we might want to know more about these instructions. What does it mean? What is it made of? How does it carry out instructions, and so forth? How is it passed on? Well, these instructions for life, the DNA itself, comes from the parent cell. Okay. Then we receive the information for our lives. We receive the information for the functions of our cells from our parents. And we call this inheritance, to receive the instructions of life from a parent cell. Okay, so then we receive the genes that are copied from these DNA. Let's talk about this a little bit more. Cells multiply or cells divide, but when cells divide, actually they each get a copy of DNA. Okay? That's how they know how to carry out their functions, because they each have a copy of instructions from the parent cell. Okay? Now we call the sections of the DNA, we call this the sections of the copied DNA, we're going to call these genes. Okay? So genes are the sections of copied DNA from the parent cell. This is what we inherit from our parents. This is how our body has the instructions to carry out its functions. So, to summarize, we receive the instructions for life, for cellular function, from the genes, the sections of copied DNA of our parents. So then the next question is, what does it mean? Whoops, I've lost track of my page here. So what is DNA exactly? We need to discuss in more detail. There we are. So when we talk about DNA, the information of life, let's think of it as a series of chains. Okay? Let's in fact think of it as two chains. It says here, two chains. We're going to think of DNA as two chains, and these two chains are parallel. They're intertwined, they run through each other, and they originate from a common axis, okay, from a common point. And we're going to call this shape of two chains that are parallel and intertwined around a common axis, we're going to call this the double helix. Okay? So then let's talk about the two chains of DNA themselves. What are they and what do they have? Okay. Let's break it down here. Now this is probably the first complex part of class. I'm going to keep it very logical and direct. Okay. So when we say two chains of DNA, what we mean are chains that are made up of nucleotides. Okay, we're going to call these NTs now. The nucleotides themselves have the genetic information, the information that has come from the parent cell. Okay. These nucleotides, which have the genetic information on the chains of DNA, there are 4 types of them. And for now, we're only going to call them ATCG. Keep it very simple. And we're going to call this chemical alphabet. Keep it very simple. The 2 chains of DNA are made up of nucleotides. These nucleotides are the information from the parent cell, okay, the genetic information. We call these 4 types of nucleotides ATCG and a chemical alphabet. So when we arrange these 4 types of nucleotides, what they result in is a sequence, and that sequence of nucleotides produces a protein. Okay? Okay, so let's break it down. In its simplest form, what we have is a sequence of nucleotides. They are read and then written by mRNA. We haven't talked about mRNA yet, but we will. The mRNA then translates the sequence of amino acids on the nucleotides, okay? And these amino acids then join to form a protein. So we're going to call a chain of amino acids then a protein. All right? Now, more specifically, what we mean when we are reading information from a gene in order to produce something from it, like a protein, we're going to call this genetic expression, or the expression of the gene itself. So the expression of the gene itself results in the production of often a protein. Okay? So when we say organisms are different, what we really mean is the sequence of nucleotides that are read and expressed are different. Okay? So what it means for an organism to be different is to have different sequences of nucleotides that are read and expressed. We call that genetic expression, which results in the production of most often a protein, which carries out the functions of a cell. Okay? So in this way, you've been introduced to the very foundations and basics of life. See you in part 3.